Okay, it's 20 past. Welcome to this symposia within the final session of BERA 2022. I'm Tanya Hope. I'm on BERA Council and a special interest group convener for educational effectiveness and improvement. I was delighted when colleagues from Germany contacted Rowena and I and asked us to be part of this particular symposium, looking at the way in which schools can be disadvantaged. So I think we're in for an interesting symposium, if I say so myself, perhaps I shouldn't. I'm also chairing this session as well as speaking, but I've handed over to my colleague Philly, who's going to chair in my absence, because I can overtalk. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my wonderful research partner, Rowena Passy, to start us off.
And yes, welcome again, welcome. Lovely to see you all, and thank you so much for coming on this long afternoon. It's been a long 3 days, hasn't it? And yeah, we very much appreciate you being here. And this presentation is about educational isolation as place-based disadvantage for schools. And it started, Tanya and I have been working together since 2010, which was when I came to Plymouth University. We just sort of hit it off, didn't we? And we started with a longitudinal project. We followed a school that had recently become an academy. Now, this was, if you'll remember, at the end of the Labour administration, the new Labour administration, when academies weren't the thing that they are now. There were very few of them that converted to academy status, and those that did came largely from schools that had been underperforming for years and years and years. And the idea was that they would have a bit of a boost. They'd be a little bit more like the private sector. Because they were a little bit more like because they were managed a little bit more like the private sector, they would have a little bit more motivation to get things moving. And there were great expectations that these underperforming schools would turn their fortunes round simply, because of the new structure of academies. So our idea was to follow one school, underperforming school, that had converted to become an academy, and we followed it when the students were in year 7, right the way through to when they finished A-levels. So it was a 7-year longitudinal study, which was fabulous. We used to go back every year, talk to the students, talk to the teachers. We all got to know each other really well, which was great. And we learned an enormous amount about educational policy, didn't we? And then halfway through the research, we widened the field to another 5 coastal academies that had changed to academy status because of at the end of the Labour administration, similar to the one that we were doing the longitudinal study with. And this is when we started to think about the concept of educational isolation. So that was phase 1. Actually, we need cool. That was the first part. Tanya then went on and did Retain, which was, this is going to sound really strange, it was about supporting early career teachers to stay in the profession. It was about supporting them with knowledge about stuff that they needed to know when they were teaching in really disadvantaged communities. It was a great success. It was very favourably reviewed by Sheffield Hallam University. It was funded by the EEF, which was, a great accolade in itself. So that was phase 2. The next phase then was our educational isolation project, in which we used a survey and case study interviews just to, we did it primarily to find out people's experiences, but also to refine our concept of educational isolation. And this is what we'll be talking about today. But the really wonderful thing about educational isolation is Project 4, Project 4, down at the bottom there. One CEO of a MAT heard about this concept of educational isolation, and bless her, she had about 20 schools in her MAT, and she organized her entire MAT to have hubs with the aim of mitigating the effects of educational isolation. So that's been a really, really exciting development for us, and we are following the fortunes of that MAT. We've got the 3rd year report coming, well, we're just writing it now, and that'll be coming out very soon. So these are our latest publications on educational isolation. We've been joined by Philly down there, who's the chair. Those are the latest publications. And now here we have our definition. We've been thinking, as you can see, as you've learnt, we've been thinking about this for a really long time. A school experiencing limited access to resources for school improvement resulting from challenges of school location. The idea is that place matters, but place is not the only constricting, limiting factor. Thank you, and I'm going to let Tanya tell you more about the detail.
And so when we say place matters, what we've identified over the last 12 years is that schools can be disadvantaged by their place. But place isn't just about geographical remoteness, it's about socioeconomic disadvantage and also about cultural isolation. So we discovered, and we did a large survey of school leaders and we didn't say it was educational isolation, we gave it a completely different title, so we weren't giving anything away. We discovered that actually those three factors combined led to a reduced opportunity to access resources, and those resources that were needed for school improvement. So we found in England that typically educationally isolated schools are coastal or rural or ex-industrial. But working with international colleagues, we've applied our concept, our theory of educational isolation, and discovered that it works just as well if it's indigenous communities in Australia, mountain schools in Norway. We've been talking at the conference to people from Canada, from America. We also talked with colleagues in Laredo in Texas and discovered that the Mexican border schools were also adhering to this idea of educational isolation being more than just geographical remoteness, that the coupling with the socioeconomic disadvantage and cultural limitations. And culture is the hardest one to define. It's not being able to access the same norms in terms of cultural engagement. So it might be going to shopping malls or leisure centres or the theatre or the museums, or also cultural diversity in terms of being a lack of it within particular communities. Those three things that we've identified there lead to these schools, because of their place, having limited access to resources. Now, we focused predominantly on a high-quality workforce, so teacher recruitment and retention. And the reason for this is because we discovered, again, over the last 12 years, and I work with schools outside of research as well, these educationally isolated schools were struggling to recruit and sustain high-quality teachers. In our schools, we found that there was a lack of churn at middle leadership and difficulties to recruit early career teachers and a high level of churn, and difficulty to recruit senior leaders. And I'll explain why in a moment. Don't know about you, but I actually conceptualize things through diagrams normally. This, as you've probably seen, is taken from Word. And it's a very basic diagram. It's not an algorithm. But what it's trying to do is show you how the three factors of educational isolation relating to place relate to the three limited resources, and the consequence, you have lower pupil attainment. In order to position this from where the research started, we need to think about where we are, and we're in England. England is a very diverse place in terms of socioeconomic factors, demography, all of those things. When the chips are down, what we've demonstrated through our writing, our analysis of literature, as well as our primary research, is that if you are a persistently disadvantaged child in an educationally isolated school, you will do less well in your educational outcomes than children in similarly disadvantaged positions in urban schools. This is in England. Place does matter. Hashtag place matters. It really does when it comes to being a disadvantaged school. These schools are disadvantaged because they can't recruit teachers, they can't access high-quality teacher development opportunities. Most of the schools in England that come up as educationally isolated are struggling to get out of requires improvement, which is an Ofsted, or our performance regulatory body's way of saying this school isn't good enough. Some of them are getting into good, but they find it hard to stay there. So we've been tracking the schools that Rowena talked about for 12 years, and things haven't been good for them. If I had more time, I would tell you about the schools individually. So we do need to think about place in relationship to disadvantage and the way in which that disadvantage plays out in schools. Because Rowena and I are qualitative longitudinal researchers, I always feel that we must give voice to the people that participate in our research. And so in a moment, I'm hoping I'll have time to do this, I'll show you some of their feedback to us and what they think about their schools. We are constantly in awe of the school leaders that we work with who participate in our research. They want to do the best that they can with the limited resources that they have. They try to make place not matter, but recognise that it does. And these quotes from DEFRA, which is our department for rural, and I'm going to forget the A, I'm looking at Billy here. Basically, it's our rural state body, and the Social Mobility Commission from 2017, which interestingly, all of the board resigned because their recommendations from the State of the Nation report weren't accepted by the government, which is interesting. And it's the only State of the Nation report that talked about the issues for coastal and rural schools in England. Both of these quotes demonstrate the impact of place on the outcomes of children. We have to be quite granular in the way in which we think about this, because if you look at regions, there's so many hot and cold spots in terms of disadvantage or opportunity. You have to look at the school. And it's the school that's disadvantaged by its place, which in turn disadvantages the children. But in an area, you can have two schools next to each other and have different outcomes, but they might still be recognised as being in the same place by your government, by our government, and therefore have access to perhaps similar funding when one needs more than the other because of those disadvantages in accessing resources. So I've talked to you a little bit about what the three challenges are. We can see here that infrastructure is hugely important. I gave evidence to the House of Lords, both committees, that were put together to look at two issues. One was seaside towns and one was rural economy. Both of these reports recognise that children in rural areas and children in coastal areas were more likely to be disadvantaged by their education than others. I think if you dig into it in more detail, it's definitely the persistently disadvantaged children that do suffer the most in terms of their outcomes and opportunities. But other infrastructural issues that impact on these communities include public transport. Imagine you're a teacher, I live in Cornwall, which if you're not from England, I hope I'm the right way around, this is Kent, this is Cornwall, opposite ends of the foot of England. Cornwall is beautiful. It's been on the telly a lot during the pandemic. Everybody's been invited to go there. But there are children in Cornwall who live a couple of miles from the sea who've never been to the beach. There are huge amounts of disadvantage. They haven't been to the beach because their parents don't have cars and there is no public transport. Imagine you're a teacher going to work in that school. You're working with children that haven't had opportunities, perhaps, that children you've worked with in urban settings have had. You work with parents who are disengaged, not because they want to be disengaged, but because education's done nothing for them. Intergenerational unemployment, and they went to the same schools as their children, and the same schools that their parents went to. So they can't see what education can do to improve the outcomes for their own children. Housing. It's really expensive, really, really expensive, but there are no jobs, no large employers. It's seasonal, part-time, sessional work with few leisure or cultural activities. You're an early career teacher. Do you want to go and live in that area? No nightlife, no fun. You may not see other younger teachers, if that early career teacher is younger. Do you want to move there if you're a middle leader and there's no job for your spouse and you can't afford a house? So there are real issues around infrastructure when thinking about how that impacts on the school's access to resources, in this case, teachers. Geographical remoteness is an issue because of the infrastructural issues. We talk to lots of teachers, and here's the voice of our participants saying, well, actually, if you have to travel 40 miles you know, and that's not a round trip, one way to go and do CPD. Or you have to take a trip of children to a museum, but actually that museum is 60 miles away. It all costs money. And we've seen in our country that actually how many children can actually pay for the trips that they do, and how can the school pay for it if the funding is disadvantaged if you're in rural areas? And our national funding formula does not support rural schools in the same way as other schools. Socioeconomic deprivation, I've talked about the lack of employment locally for educationally isolated schools. This does impact on the way in which schools can recruit, but also on the aspirations and expectations of the teachers and the students themselves. And this was from our early research, and I think it says quite a lot about living in a coastal area and the student and staff expectations. I'm watching your eyes to see if you finished. And then cultural isolation. So cultural isolation has to be taken into account, and Rowena and I have seen different reports that hint towards educational isolation, but they might talk about political awareness, but what they're actually talking about is cultural isolation. And so we've seen, you know, the work that we've been doing, taking on sort of different ideas and different terminology. And one thing we would call for, and one reason we developed this theory, this concept of educational isolation, is to give us one voice, one term to talk about, so that we can all have a shared language and know that actually we're not talking about coastal, we're not talking about rural. In Israel, we're not talking about periphery. Actually, we're all talking about educationally isolated schools. And this cultural isolation has more impact than you can imagine. So these children will have challenges in accessing the diversity that their urban peers would have, because it costs money for the school to organise trips to raise awareness, but it's part of the curriculum in England. The same, just going out, perhaps going to a bowling alley, it's not part of their cultural norm. I've talked about the three predominant resources that they're limited in access to. There are more, but these are the key ones that came out from our survey of senior leaders. Because we talk about teacher supply a lot, I thought it's quite useful to have a look at some statistics here. And when you link that back to educationally isolated schools, we have clear evidence that schools that are educationally isolated in England are more likely to have unqualified teachers than non-educationally isolated schools. They're more likely to have a high turnover of early career teachers than non-educationally isolated schools, and they have harder times in recruiting senior leaders than non-educationally isolated schools. Place matters. Mind you, they struggle to get rid of middle leaders, which can have its own issues, as you would imagine, in terms of being innovative and taking on new initiatives that come out of policy. And we've never had more rapid policy making than we've had in the last 10 years. And here are a few more voices from our research. Trying to recruit young staff to coastal rural areas, very difficult. Talented teachers, middle leaders often leave. Our staff face travel challenges, all the things that I've just talked to you about. When Rowena and I first started reporting on our wider coastal schools research, it was interesting that DFE did not disaggregate. There wasn't a term for coastal schools at that point in time. And so I disaggregated the DFE data, which demonstrated the impact that being a coastal school had on your access to teachers and the disadvantage these schools had in terms of staffing, which you can see there. We're hoping that levelling up, we seem to have got a new minister for levelling up. We thought that might disappear with the government shift around, which was only yesterday, I think. But the levelling up idea is that the government has recognised that place impacts and disadvantages some communities in England, and they're going to try and do something about it. And this is part of the department's response to issues that they're aware about, for teacher recruitment and retention. If I had more time, I'd talk to you about those strategies, but it's easy to access it through the links in our PowerPoint. So in conclusion then, educational isolation has typically and entirely been related to geographical remoteness. We think, and we would argue, that it's not. That in order to understand it fully, you have to have cultural isolation and socioeconomic deprivation as factors that impact on those schools as part of their place. One of the biggest issues for school improvement is having the teachers in place that can do the job effectively, and they struggle to achieve that. As I said before, rural and coastal schools have not matched the performance of urban schools in similarly deprived communities, which mean the children's outcomes haven't matched them either. And our research has spanned over 10 years, and in that time we've seen lots of policy-driven engagements with the issue, but no action. And I took that picture near my house. A school's place should not be a disadvantage, but for educational isolated schools, it is. Thank you.
Thank you for the insight in the concept of educational isolation and in your long-standing research. And I think it is fascinating to see such a project that follows school for so many years. My question refers to the concept of the few cultural chances that students have, and I would like to learn more about how you can enrich the opportunities for students in these remote areas to participate in cultural life.
One of the things
very good question.
Yeah, it's great. One of the things that in particularly isolated rural areas, you don't have a cultural mix of people. You don't have an ethnic mix. It tends to be largely a white population. And when you're in an inner city, there are all sorts of different vibrant cultures around you. And these youngsters don't have that sort of vibrancy. You know, they have a vibrant English culture, if you like, but they don't have a diversity around them. So that's one thing. And schools used to take their children up to London and places such as that, you know, so that they could experience being in a big city and to have all sorts of different things, new things around them, but unfortunately can't afford that so much. But there are also, you know, there's fewer museums, there's fewer cinemas, there's fewer bowling alleys. So we're not talking high culture here, you know. We're not talking about going to the opera or to the theatre on a regular basis. It's just having a diversity of experience that opens the eyes to different things that are going on in different parts of the world. And it is difficult.
I would say that the pandemic has actually brought some opportunities as well as some challenges, well, lots of challenges. So for the education isolated schools we've been working with, what they've been able to do is tap into the access to Teams or Zoom or whichever virtual platform that they've been using. And what I've seen lots more of is being able to engage with schools in urban settings, for example, that have a much more diverse mix of students and actually engaging with other schools that way. So they've been trying to use the technology that the pandemic's brought them. A caveat to that is many education isolated schools don't have the infrastructure of super fast broadband and so may be doubly disadvantaged as a consequence of their infrastructure. But those education isolated schools that do, and I use Cornwall as an example again, they had fibre put in, and there's I think I can only think of one school that's still struggling and has got a slow broadband, but it still has it. They are using that to extend their experiences to meet the demands of the curriculum in relation to diversity. They're still struggling, though, with opportunities in terms of trips and visits because of the cost. You've probably heard, if you're not from England, and everyone in England knows, that we've got this fuel crisis. The schools are going into an awful situation where they can't afford on the funding that they get, and the funding, thank you, and the funding is the year before to actually cover the cost of their staff at the moment. So I think we're going to be seeing in the next few months the loss of not necessarily teaching staff, but probably teaching assistants to cover the fuel bills, but it means that trips and visits will probably be cut as well. So I think any progress that we've made in the schools that we've been looking at in terms of organising trips and visits may be lost. So it's a little bit depressing, I'm sorry. But there are small things, anecdotal things that we've heard of that schools are doing that I can share with you afterwards as well. Lovely. Thank you very much, everyone.
Good afternoon to everyone. We're so happy that you all came. I'm giving this presentation today on behalf of our head of department, who's also here, Professor Abs, and our colleague Mirte van Veldhuizen, who actually organized this whole symposium for us, and she's at the moment at home on maternity leave and expecting her third child. So that's really exciting for her. But she would have loved to be here, but yes, that's why she's not here. So today I'm happy about the opportunity to talk to you about introducing an adaptive mentor training program aimed at disadvantaged schools across Europe, and share with you first results from our project, Novice Educators Support and Training, NEST for short. To start, let's take a look at the situation of novice teachers. Novice teachers across Europe and also worldwide frequently work at schools in challenging situations and feel less confident about their teaching ability. This indicates a specific need for support for novice teachers in the early years of their teaching career, preferably in the form of a good induction program that includes mentoring. However, neither induction nor mentoring programs are available to all novice teachers across the world, and only half of novice teachers take part in an official induction program, and only 22% report having actually an assigned mentor to help them. Among other things, lack of structured mentoring for novice teachers seems to contribute to high attrition rates among novice teachers in the first 5 years of their teaching careers. It is especially important to strengthen teachers' professional development at disadvantaged schools, because teachers, and especially novice teachers, have to deal with more challenging situations, and novice teacher retention is an even greater problem at disadvantaged schools. Mentoring that focuses on supporting teachers rather than assessing them can contribute to higher levels of teacher satisfaction and a greater sense of fulfillment, thereby increasing self-efficacy and resilience and reducing teacher attrition. On the other hand, if mentors fail to provide the social and psychological support which the novice teacher needs, mentoring can actually contribute to teacher attrition. Especially this finding highlights that good support and training for mentors themselves is a precondition for obtaining the desired positive effects from setting up a mentoring program. Cresborn and his colleagues posited that it is important for the mentor to tailor the mentoring approach to the specific needs of individual mentees, and that selecting a suitable mentoring approach is a precondition for creating positive effects on novice teachers. Therefore, adaptivity is an important quality indicator on the mentoring that is provided. All of this basically sets the screen for our NEST project. So the NEST project is co-funded by the European Union as an Erasmus Plus Key Action 3 policy experimentation. So what does it mean, policy experimentation? It means that in order to apply for this type of project, several European countries which share a common challenge have to come up with a scalable solution for this challenge in terms of a new policy or an intervention. The participating countries in our NEST project are Austria, Belgium, and in Belgium, Wallonia and Flanders are both participating, Bulgaria, Romania, and Spain, where Catalonia and the region of Madrid are participating, which means that in our project we actually have 7 different education systems that take part. Those education systems all face the common challenge that they have high attrition rates of novice teachers at disadvantaged schools. And because the teachers at disadvantaged schools face similar challenges and need specific competences, the countries in the project came up with a solution of developing a scalable adaptive mentor training program that can be used to reduce attrition rates at disadvantaged schools across Europe. As the evaluators of the project, we are interested in how far the NEST mentor training program is adaptive to the challenges novice teachers face who work at disadvantaged schools. In order to answer this question, we first need to define the term disadvantaged school. So first of all, there are different terms used, such as a school situated in a disadvantaged area, disadvantaged school, or deprived school. Then there is the distinction between a disadvantaged school and underperforming or low-performing schools. As we've just heard before, there can be a strong correlation between the two. So a disadvantaged school is often a low-performing or underperforming school as well, but there are also examples where a disadvantaged school performs quite well. So we came up with our own definition of a disadvantaged school is confronted with more difficulties than other schools in the same education system to provide an adequate social and learning context, enabling students to acquire competences and reach their maximum potential. So this is the definition that we work with when we talk about disadvantaged schools. We also wanted to describe how schools in disadvantaged areas are defined or what indicators are used to classify them as disadvantaged schools. A literature research that we did yielded several predominant indicators to classify schools as disadvantaged, which can be divided into input and output criteria. For the output criteria, the socioeconomic status of students, the type of area where the school is located, employment rates in, for instance, the school district, or the educational level of parents were mentioned. For the output criteria, we found references to low educational achievement of the students or the proportion of students qualifying for high school. Then we looked at official documents and conducted interviews with representatives of the education sector in the 7 education systems which participate in our project to find out how they classify a school as disadvantaged. And for the purpose of today's presentation, we decided to only focus on 2 education systems, Romania and Catalonia, because those 2 countries were also most closely involved in developing the mentoring training program, which we will present later on. And that means that in those countries, this mentor training program has been implemented, let's say, in its purest form. So the indicators to identify or classify disadvantaged schools used in Romania are the proportion of untrained teachers at the school, the level of socioeconomic development of the locality of the school, the proportion of students that drop out of school, and the average mark students achieve in national assessment. The indicators used in Catalonia are the educational level of the parents, the employment type and employment status of parents, the proportion of migrant students at the school, and the proportion of students with special educational needs. Now that we define disadvantaged schools and have an idea about how education systems identify disadvantaged schools, let's take a look at the NEST mentor training program, which focuses on disadvantaged schools. So the aim of the training program is to introduce adaptive mentoring for novice teachers at disadvantaged schools. Through interviews with representatives from all education systems, and we also did a small survey, we were able to identify 5 specific challenges. Those challenges were the challenge to reach every student, the challenge to maintain high expectations for every student, a challenge for families to support students with their learning, a high percentage of students from culturally diverse and/or discriminated minorities, and a high or very high percentage of immigrant students or refugees. The training intends to support the mentors in developing an adaptive mentoring style that is suitable to support novice teachers in dealing with these challenges. So what you see here now on the slide is the structure of the NEST adaptive mentor training for the first year. Overall, it goes for 2 years, and it's a combination of online and on-site learning. And the terms in the first year are all structured identically, so we're just going to zoom in and look at the separate parts of training, practice, and metacognition. The training part was mostly carried out online due to the restrictions during the pandemic. An online learning platform was set up, which contained all the learning content, the reflection exercises, and practical exercises with peer mentors in 5 modules. In these online modules, the mentors learn specific techniques that they can use to support the novice teachers at the disadvantaged schools. For instance, coaching techniques, how to prompt reflection, tools to note down the development of their novice teacher, and also tools for their own reflection, such as a portfolio to document their own development. As mentoring in a lot of the participating countries still has a very strong connotation of assessment, and the mentor having having the role of an expert and being a role model that needs to be emulated, the aim was to shift from a more directive mentoring approach to a facilitative approach. And mentors should be able to adapt their own mentoring approach according to the needs and personality of the novice teacher after the training. The practical part of the training program allowed the mentors to put into practice the techniques which they learned in the online modules with their own novice teachers. The mentors' level of independence will increase during the course of the training program. During the observation and feedback cycles in the first year, the trainers will be present, but steadily reduce their role and involvement, and in the second year, the trainers will no longer be present during the observation and feedback sessions, but will still have a reflection session with the mentors afterwards. So in the first year, the trainer who trains the mentor will always be there when they talk to the mentee and to the novice teacher and reflect the lesson, and later on he will not be present anymore, so slowly guiding them into independence. Each term ends with an online meeting during which the NEST trainers and the mentors reflect on the professional growth and development that the NEST mentors have achieved. So before we take a look at the results from the training, I would like to quickly show you our evaluation design. With this design, we're comparing specially trained mentors who mentor novice teachers, those are the intervention groups, with a control group of mentors who are not participating in any special training, but also support novice teachers. For today's presentation, we will focus on data obtained at the first and second measuring point for the mentors, which was before the training program started, and at the end of the first school year, where most of the content modules have already been covered. And we'll also show you some data from the second measurement point for the novice teachers, also at the end of the first school year, and we just wanted to have a look at the novice teacher data to have a different perspective on the mentor data. Now I will show you a table with the sample sizes for the groups, and I highlighted the samples that are relevant for today's presentation, namely the mentors and novice teachers of the intervention groups. For the results, we want to take a look at the mentoring competence of mentors and answer, where do we see development? What are mentors' strengths? Do novice teachers see it the same way? And are there differences between education systems? We also want to take a look at the focus of the mentoring and see whether it relates to the indicators used to classify disadvantaged schools or the challenges identified for the disadvantaged schools. We developed a scale for mentoring competence comprising of 10 items. We asked mentors to assess their mentoring competence on a scale of 0, no ability, to 6, very high ability. And we found that mentors in Romania and Catalonia both already assessed themselves pretty high before the training even started. So mentors in Catalonia assessed themselves on all the items 4.2 or higher on a 6-point scale, and in Romania 4.7 or higher. So it's kind of hard to see improvement. But we did see improvement. So where did we see significant increases? For Romania, we saw increases in the area that mentors feel that they can better constructively deal with mentees' mistakes, that they feel more able to prompt reflection for their mentees, and increase mentees' professional resilience. For Catalonia, we found significant increases in the ability to relate to professional teaching standards, also prompting mentees' reflection and analyzing mentees' professional development needs. We were also interested to see which of the areas were rated the highest from the standpoint of the mentors and as well the standpoint of the novice teachers. And it was interesting to see that actually the 3 areas that were rated the highest amongst both groups were the same. So I noted down those 3 highest ones. So for Romania and Catalonia, the highest one was actually the same. Mentors are able to give mentees constructive feedback. This was assessed the highest from both perspectives. Then the second highest for Romania was mentors are able to build supportive relationships with mentees. For Catalonia, it was mentors are able to prompt mentees to reflect on their teaching, which was also in Catalonia one where we saw a significant increase. And the third highest for Romania was mentors are able to encourage mentees to perceive their school as a professional learning environment. And for Catalonia, it was mentors are able to deal with mentees' mistakes in a constructive way. So overall, mentors and novice teachers rated all areas of mentoring competence high or very high. So not only mentors feel competent, but novice teachers confirm this self-assessment. These are the ones that I just showed you that are assessed the highest by both groups and show that the mentor-mentee relationship is supportive and constructive. We also asked mentors to what extent they focused their mentoring on certain aspects and found that the strongest focus both in Romania and Catalonia was on engaging hard-to-reach learners, teaching students with emotional and behavioral difficulties, and managing a diverse classroom effectively. If we think of the different indicators classifying disadvantaged schools that I showed in the beginning, we might expect a different picture, not so much for Romania, where output indicators such as student achievement were relevant, but for Catalonia, where the proportion of migrant students and parents statistics were important. However, in terms of the challenges at disadvantaged schools, we can find all 5 challenges represented. My hypothesis is that the mentors focus on the imminent challenges of the novice teachers and that managing a diverse classroom and engaging all students and especially hard-to-reach learners as well as dealing with emotional and behavioral difficult students are the areas where novice teachers feel that they need the most support. To conclude, we showed that education systems use a broad variety of indicators to classify disadvantaged schools. However, schools often share similar challenges. Novice teachers at disadvantaged schools are in need of additional support. And here, adaptive mentoring is used as an approach to address teachers' challenges. We could show that mentors feel that their mentoring competence has increased over time, so during the training, and novice teachers also assess mentoring competences of their mentors on average as very high. Mentors focus their mentoring in relation to the different challenges at disadvantaged schools, with the highest focus on supporting their mentees to engage hard-to-reach learners, dealing with emotional and behavioral difficult students, and managing a diverse classroom effectively. Thank you very much. Right, so I would say there is actually a parallel to your study where it's rural schools and also schools in mountainous areas. So that's where the schools that participate in the program are at, and they have when we were still in the recruiting phase, trying to find people to participate. I think it was Romania where we had trouble not finding mentors but novice teachers. So there were mentors willing to mentor, but there were no novice teachers So they had to change the strategy a little bit so the mentors travel more to different schools, and that wasn't planned in the beginning. So yeah, since we're dealing with 7 different systems and they all have differences in how they identify what counts as a disadvantaged school, countries have had to use different different strategies to put the whole program into place and recruit the people that they need. And in some countries, they really were struggling to find any indicators. Some countries are really good at it. They have indicators and they have like formal official papers about it, but some countries don't, or some education systems, I should say, don't.
Any other questions? In which case, Eva, I've got a question. Your work's really interesting. Thank you for sharing it with us. It reminds me very much of the Retain programme that Rowena mentioned in our presentation. And the schools that were selected for the sample for that were disadvantaged rural and coastal schools. And one of the purposes was to create an intervention which included mentoring to support teacher retention. I wonder whether you'd made any connection between effective mentoring in your programme with your adaptive mentoring and teacher retention, because you mentioned the high attrition earlier on in your presentation.
We still want to do that. We're still kind of in the middle of the project, so we just had the second the second data collection just came in, so the data that we showed you today were like brand new or fresh. So we can't really say anything about it yet, but we really hope to make this connection, because that was sort of the starting point for everything. That's the challenge that they all share, that they have these problems, that novice teachers just leave. And I mean, like in your presentation, you showed the same kind of data, right? And novice teachers leave anyway, and at disadvantaged schools, this problem is even bigger.
Yeah, we've got in England at the moment, we've got 12.5% with the latest DFE data leaving by year 1, and within year 1, which is hugely expensive, isn't it, for the country in training and then that loss. And we know, having looked at teacher retention internationally as well, that it's across the board, isn't it? So your definition of novice, is that year 1 to 3?
We wanted it to be year 1 and 2 actually, but since they had so much trouble recruiting people for it, they widened it to 1 to 5, because you can also find literature where it actually says novice teacher goes up from year 1 to year 5. But we asked, we have this question in our survey, how much teaching experience they have, so we can also filter them. And sometimes for some of our graphics, we just had a report come out. And so for some of our graphics, we decided we're just focusing on the people who are really new and leave the ones out that already have 5 years of teaching experience, and just concentrated on the 1 and 2 year teachers.
Yeah. No, I can understand that, and it is hard. Eva, thank you. If we don't have any more questions, that was really illuminating.
Hello and welcome to my presentation, the very last one. My name is Franziska Proskawetz. I'm from Germany and I work as a researcher at the University of Duisburg-Essen. And today I will introduce you to the German joint project Schule macht stark, which has just recently started and which can be translated into Schools Make Strong. In this presentation, I would like to introduce you to the project in general, to the topic cluster School Development and Leadership in specific, and to our work with the project schools on their way to the development of a resource-oriented school culture. SCHUMAS, which is the acronym or shortened name of the project, is an interdisciplinary network consisting of 13 institutions from all over Germany. And the expertise of the participating scientists lies particularly in the field of school improvement and instructional research. The overall objective of the project is to develop, effective, research-based and practice-proven approaches for schools serving socially disadvantaged communities and to ensure equal opportunities for all students. The project follows a research-practice partnership approach, and it is designed to be co-constructive and collaborative. Researchers and practitioners want to meet at eye level and learn from each other. As you can see here, the project is divided into 2 stages. The focus of stage 1 is on the development and testing of measures and strategies in the field of school improvement and instructional improvement. And in stage 1, SCHUMAS accompanies and supports 200 schools in socially disadvantaged areas over a period of 5 years. And then in stage 2, these concepts and strategies will probably be transferred to other schools. Here you can see the overall structure of the project, and as you can see, SCHUMAS is divided into 4 topic clusters, which focus on different contents: instructional development, professional development, school development and leadership, as well as extracurricular learning and the social area. In the project, there are also 4 so-called regional centers, and these regional centers work directly and intensively with the schools and act as a link between the content clusters and the schools. And I myself work for the topic cluster School Development and Leadership. The main development goals of our cluster are to develop, test, and evaluate context-sensitive approaches to strengthen the school-wide capacity for improvement, to promote an empowering resource-oriented school culture with a growth mindset, and to support the development of leadership skills. But what does our work in the project Schule macht stark look like? How exactly do we work together with the schools? In the following, I would like to introduce 2 of our offerings for the schools. One of our offerings is our web-based professional learning platform, and the other one is our design-based workshop. And in the design-based workshop, we are going to work intensively with 22 schools from this month on. We will actually start next week with our work. And the design-based workshop will last over 2 to 3 years. And during the workshop, the schools will work on a so-called practical problem they are facing at their schools. For example, something like a weak school culture. And in small peer groups, the schools will try to find solutions to solve their practical problem. And then the measures the schools develop are tested individually at the schools. All of our 200 project schools can access our professional learning platform, which I will now introduce in more detail. On our professional learning platform that we call School Development in Context, we compile research-based insights and information on successful school development strategies in schools serving disadvantaged communities. By this, we would like to address principals, but also teachers and other pedagogical staff. The topics covered by the platform are relevant for the strengthening of school improvement capacities, leadership skills, and the empowerment of a resource-oriented school culture with a growth mindset. The topics also include the identification of a vision specific to the school, the setting of targets, as well as the reflecting and changing of school culture. And by using, for example, vignettes based on real cases, we try to set up the professional learning platform as close to practice as possible. The professional learning platform is designed as a self-learning platform, and the content is successively updated and extended. And before the publication of new contents, we always have practitioners proofread the texts and give us feedback. And also the regional centers I already introduced support the work with the platform. In addition, a digital portfolio can be accessed via the platform. And the digital portfolio is supposed to accompany and support the schools during their school development process. On top of that, we always try to make the platform as interactive as possible. For example, by adding graphics, videos, interviews with practitioners, links, and reflection questions, we try to facilitate interactive and varied engagement with the content. The platform is also suitable as an exchange platform for schools. We added a forum and a so-called search offer exchange to enable the exchange of experiences and information between the schools. And the principle of co-construction is implemented through the feedback from the participants. So the participants of the platform can contribute to the expansion of the platform through feedback and interest in specific topics. Now I would like to give you a brief insight into the platform and also into a chapter of the platform. So here you can see the start page of the platform in German, and the topics for which content is available and will be made available soon. And one chapter is focusing the strengthening of school culture, in German Schulkultur stärken. And now, during the next few minutes, I would like to give you a brief overview of the chapter's contents. So, how can school culture be strengthened in schools? In the chapter Strengthening School Culture, we introduce the mindsets of resource orientation and deficit orientation, and also provide some general knowledge on school culture and how it can be changed. We introduce, for example, the levels of culture according to Schein, and we deal with the theory of attribution according to Weiner, which I would now like to present as an example. By working on attributions, teachers can, for example, be motivated to reflect on their own teaching, and they can, if necessary, improve it. And according to Weiner and his theory of attribution, it makes a difference for the motivation of the teacher, how the teacher explains a failure. For example, the poor test performance of the students. For example, the teacher could locate a cause of poor test scores within or outside him or herself. He or she could see the cause as stable over time or as variable. He or she could think that he has an influence on the cause or not. And he or she could consider the cause as global or as specific. And favorable would be an attribution style in which the teachers perceive the cause to be within him or herself, temporally variable, controllable, and to occur only in specific situations. That gives the teacher the feeling that he or she is in control of his performance and has room to intervene. And this then increases the teacher's motivation for the future and makes it easier for him or her to improve his or her performance. Because only when the teacher perceives a course as something he or she can influence, he or she feels that it can be changed. And this increases the teacher's motivation. We also added many impulses for reflection, case studies from everyday school life, as well as some project ideas to the chapter. And the case study, Visit to the Zoo, informs head of schools what needs to be done to establish a resource-oriented school culture and also the importance of all the teachers of the school. And now, during the last few minutes, I would like to tell you the story of the visit to the zoo. It is based on a real incident. Miss Donaldson visits the zoo with a group of students. The students are supposed to take part in a project day and do cognitively demanding tasks, besides a nice part with watching a movie. And even before the visit to the zoo, Miss Donaldson is worried about whether her students will be able to complete the tasks, as she thinks the students are disinterested and not very hardworking. Miss Donaldson is all the more surprised when on the day of the excursion, she sees an unexpected picture of her students. The students complete even the most challenging tasks. And when Miss Donaldson meets 3 of her colleagues in the canteen the day after the excursion, she enthusiastically reports on how interested she experienced the students at the zoo. Her colleagues, who also perceive the students as rather disinterested and underachieving, are irritated. "Are you sure you're talking about our students?" one of the colleagues jokes. "What kind of tasks did they do?" Miss Donaldson explains that the zoo employee first showed the students a film about the zoo. Before she can continue, her colleague interrupts her with a laugh. "A film? Then everything is clear. Of course, our students are able to watch movies, television, series, and browse the internet. Books and texts, on the other hand, would be too demanding." Miss Donaldson is frustrated that she didn't come up with this logical explanation herself. Of course, she thinks that movies are great. Miss Donaldson is no longer surprised about the successful day at the zoo. So Miss Donaldson's initial irritation could not lead to a sustainable change in her assumptions about the students. Instead, Miss Donaldson's assumptions were confirmed by her colleagues instead of being further irritated. Miss Donaldson's colleague offers an explanation for why the students were shown to be engaged and hardworking during the zoo field trip, consistent with Miss Donaldson's initial assumptions. This brief insight into the professional learning platform and also into one chapter of our professional learning platform already brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm happy to hear all of your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Franziska. That's an amazing project. Huge.
Yeah.
Can I ask who funds it?
It's funded by the state of Germany, but also by the different states inside of Germany. Yeah.
If only we had a government that would do that.
Thanks very much. I'm really interested in the platform that you've got there. Could you tell us a little bit more about it? Can anybody access it, or is it only open to people who are in the project?
Yeah, right now it's only open to the project schools, but inside the schools all the teachers and principals and everyone can access it. But we try to make it, maybe in the future we can make it accessible for everyone who's interested. And maybe we can also put it into a book to publish it. So that's what we right now think of. But right now, unfortunately, it's only for the schools, the project schools.
So when you were setting it up, did you have a lot of help to make sure that your project school staff would be able to understand how to use it? Or is it using very obvious access means that anyone could get onto it and get going on it? Because I think of a project that we're involved in, it takes a bit of time to get people to understand how to use it.
Yeah, that's true. We started with the platform only in May this year, so all the project schools got a password for the platform, and we also did some explanation of how to use the platform and how it works. And now we are still waiting for some of the schools to enter the platform. So we can see that a lot of schools are already on the platform, some are not. But it's really hard to, we don't know if the texts we put on the platform, if they are read. We don't know that. So we can only see how many people, for example, downloaded some of the papers we put onto the platform. So but we really hope that a little bit more schools will be interested in the platform,
Thanks very much.
Can I just ask, have you had any feedback from the schools about the platform yet?
Not yet, unfortunately,
Early days.
Sorry, but is there a plan to have some evaluation of the platform in order to know more about how schools make use of it?
Yes, we will evaluate the platform, but not right now, I think. But in the future, we are planning to do that, and also the digital portfolio that can be accessed via the platform. We would also like to evaluate that. So we hope that the schools allow us to look at their portfolios in the end of stage 1 of the project. So that would be very interesting,
I know a little bit more about it because I had a chat with Franziska last night. So Franziska, tell us about the workshop that you're planning with the co-construction. I think that's very interesting for everyone.
The workshop, I think I also have, if we have time, I have another slide about the workshop. So the workshop right now, here it says 21 schools, but we will work together with 22 schools a little bit more intensively. It's scheduled right now for 3 years, but the schools will work on some kind of practical problem they have at their schools. And during that workshop, the schools will meet in small peer groups together with us, and we will try to find a solution to solve their problem. For example, some of the schools might have a problem, or maybe they had a problem with students not wearing masks during the COVID pandemic. So we will try to figure out how to solve that problem. And first of all, one thing is to look at the problem in a more resource-oriented manner. So we will, for example, ask the teachers, are there no students who are wearing masks, or are there at least some students who already wear masks? So we ask them to count the students. How many of your students are wearing masks? And is there really no student who is wearing a mask? So that's the first step to solve that problem, that they see the problem as something, not as a problem, maybe as a challenge, but as something they can work on. And if some students already wear masks, then other students might wear masks in the future as well. So we try to find solutions to solve the problem together with the schools. But of course, the schools need to go back to their schools and try to solve the problem. If it doesn't work, we will try to find a different solution for the schools. So that's why it takes, it might take 3 years to solve that kind of problem, yeah.
Thank you, Franziska. Have we got any further questions? In which case, oh, did you have a, was there a hand up? No. In which case, thank you very much. That was really interesting. Good luck with the project. It looks like there's lots more to do. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start by thanking all of the speakers for their excellent presentations. I found them very perceptive and insightful, and also thank you for sharing. Specifically, the last two presentations, Eva and Franziska, about your interventions, which I think are absolutely necessary in the state of education today. In terms of what this session was all about, it was looking at disadvantage and how that's conceptualized in an international context. And the thing that struck me first was that there are strong indications in all three of the presentations we heard about how context matters, with even the creation of definitions that encompass this point of context. So we heard about challenges that are not faced by other schools in terms of disadvantage, and that was one of the aspects of the definitions in the educational isolation and NEST project definitions. And in terms of education, it seemed like this was a little bit more school-focused. It was looking at the conditions, the place-based challenges that the schools faced, whereas in NEST and the Schumas project, we were looking mostly at the students and the socioeconomic makeup of the students. But it wasn't just socioeconomic factors there, where some were similar and some were slightly different. So, for example, in Romania, we were looking at socioeconomic deprivation broadly, whereas in Catalonia, it included education and employment status of parents, so it was drilled down a little bit further. But there were also other things too, like the high proportion of students who dropped out and low attainment in one country, and in another country, high numbers of migrants and special educational needs students. And even in Germany, where you've got this countrywide look at schools that are in socially disadvantaged areas, but where those definitions might have come locally or regionally from each of the 16 states. And another thing that I noticed, context matters even specifically for NEST, in using that as an example, where it's an adaptive approach to the individual mentor. So it's their context there for the individual mentor and mentee, even down to that individual level. Context is really important. I also noticed that all presenters spoke about school improvement in one way or another. So in terms of teacher supply, obviously, big thing for educational isolation, that was the one that was focused on today, and also NEST. There was the development of leadership skills, which was one of the other areas in educational isolation and Schumas. We had professional development in terms of staff, across all of them, support for school staff as well, everybody touched on that, and raising attainment, which was explicit in some instances and implicit in others, but that unfortunately, in England, we have, when you talk about school improvement, it's very closely linked with raising attainment, and I don't know very much about the German context, but I'm guessing there's some similarities there as well. And one other thing that I noticed that was mentioned was this equality of opportunities, which was explicit in the Schumas project. That specifically mentions it as an aim. It's kind of it's embedded in educational isolation, thinking about the equality of opportunities for the students in those schools, particularly when we were talking about cultural isolation before, although that's only one aspect. And it's implicit in NEST schools through the support for novice teachers. There was one difference that I noticed, and this, I found this very interesting, and maybe this is something that might come up in the questions. The first paper took more of a theoretical approach, looking at a theoretical review, looking at it, presenting the concept overall of educational isolation, while only mentioning in passing these school improvement interventions that were linked with the research, like, for example, RETAIN, which looks at providing support and professional development to early career teachers to keep them in the profession, whereas the other two papers, Eva's and Francisca's, looked in detail at the interventions that could help schools that are experiencing these challenges that other schools don't experience. But even here, there were connections. For example, the focus on teacher supply and the focus on professional development and the quality of teaching. One of the questions that was considered in the overview of the section in the written blurb that we had when we were looking, if you downloaded the app to look at the sessions, was whether, despite different contextualized definitions of disadvantage in the different international context, whether the interventions proposed may be transferable. And this question was addressed by the SCHUMAS project. It was mentioned that that's one of the aims of the project, asking whether its concepts and strategies could be transferable to other schools. And similarly, the NEST project looks at whether its research is scalable throughout Europe, and educational isolation, with its deliberately broad definition, argues for the contextualization of individual circumstances, which should also enable transferability. So, I have a question about that for all three of you, but I would like to open the floor first to if anybody has any questions they would like to ask before we come to the individual speakers with my question. Okay, then I will ask my question and then open the floor afterwards. So for all of you, my question is, along those lines that I was just talking about the transferability, with the research we saw presented today, do the speakers see any commonalities or maybe any areas of divergence between their research and the research of the other speakers, and whether there are any concepts, ideas, or practices in the other research that could potentially be useful for your own? And would the speakers like to come up here to answer it, or do you want to just stay where you are? It's up to you.
I've just noticed that we've lost Eva, so...
Oh, Eva's back. Yes, I'll repeat the question. So, Eva, the question I was asking was, given the research that was presented today and everything we've heard, do you see any commonalities or indeed any areas of divergence between your research and that of the others, and whether any of the concepts, ideas, or practices described in the research that we've heard about today is potentially useful for your own? And that's a question for all three of you, or all four of you, but, oh, Rowena, you're over there, right, all four of you.
So I'm happy to start. When I was listening to the other research, I was seeing lots of commonalities. Obviously, this symposium was put together because we're looking at disadvantaged schools. And that's our common starting point quite clearly. How do we understand and support those schools that are disadvantaged by particular things? And I think the difference, the divergence is that Rowena and I have tried to identify a concept that will allow us to understand how to frame those schools in a way that can have a universal language, so that we don't have to keep saying, well, this one's rural, it's socioeconomically deprived, it's also got this, it's also got that. So trying to bring a commonality of place-based experiences, which quite clearly were coming out of the experiences of the schools that you were working with, but perhaps articulated in different ways. And I know yesterday when I went to Yale's presentation about schools in Israel, there were lots of commonalities coming out that could easily identify her schools as educationally isolated, but in Israel they're more often described as peripheral. So I think the commonalities come from the challenges of place and infrastructure that these schools experience, which necessitates an intervention that will make things more equal for them, actually provide equity possibly for them compared to other schools that don't have those challenges. That would be my take on it. Rowena, would you want to add to that? Eva or Francis?
think it's just interesting how the disadvantages are different, even among the schools in the NEST project. Whereas your schools were mostly, the peripheral schools, right? Not the city schools, but in our project, some of the schools are city schools, but they're like in not the best parts of town, and so I don't know if this idea of cultural disadvantages would also fit for them, but then sometimes it's even hard to get to a theater or a library or something if you are in a town. It's still hard to get to the other end of the town, or you need to get a bus ticket and something like that, right? So
I would actually say that I'll just shout. Our schools, within our first part of our project, so the 7 years, and then the additional schools that we had included, I'm not sure there's a phrase for this, but peripheral city schools. So they were next to cities, but actually because of the transport issues and all of those things, they were educationally isolated. So geographical remoteness doesn't mean that you have to be in a field in the middle of nowhere. It can be that you're just disconnected because of the infrastructural challenges from your nearest town, or you can be in a town but still not have access to what you need to in the way you've described.
And I think you can also be isolated if you think in terms of ghetto schools, where they're like little islands in a city, but they're still isolated.
We would say they were unsupported schools, so they didn't get school-to-school support because then schools that no other schools want to work with.
Right.
I'm wondering what we should go for, whether we should go for a common terminology or not. There may be advantages in common terminology, for instance, in terms of campaigning and in terms of international dialogue. But on the other hand, for me, it's also a research question whether common terminology could also hide away the specific needs that some contexts may hold. So, for instance, if the context of a school is that they have a lot of students with immigrant background, where these students do not speak the language of instruction, this is a different challenge compared to a rural area where teachers and students all speak the same language. And therefore, for your question for more common unified concept is for me a question for the advantages of generic concepts on the one hand, opposed to the chances that specific concepts bring with them in terms of adaptivity. So it might be that a more specific concept provides a background or hints to the need to develop something more adaptive. But then again, the question is, are we already prepared to really provide this adaptive support? Are our education systems prepared to provide this adaptive support? And at least when we look at the NEST project, at this European project, there the education systems had the energy to set up some generic European tool, and now we work with this and try to implement it in diverse contexts. And that for us is a research question, in how far we really can help schools with this more generic approach.
If everyone's happy, I'll respond to that. And then I'll pass it to Eva. Pardon? Okay. So I would say, taking your example, we would call it English as an additional language in this country. So a child or a student who doesn't speak the language of the school instruction, as you put it. This wouldn't come under what we would be looking at in educational isolation, because we've tried to identify it at school level, so in relation to place. So it's all about the place-based challenges that impact on schools and cause disadvantage. So while that might be a context for the school, which we would welcome and try and understand, it's not necessarily a key feature of all place-based challenges, but would come into the element of cultural isolation potentially. So we believe that context is everything. It really is. And we were hoping that by having a common language around place-based challenges for schools, we would explore and develop those contexts within it, not negate them. Who was next? Was it?
I'm from Israel, and yesterday it was the first time I heard about educational isolation. I think it's very interesting. I try to fit in to the Israeli educational system, and as a qualitative researcher, what I think is about the objective definitions of isolation in the terms you talked about, alongside subjective definitions. So what I'm thinking about is to go to Israeli educators in the rural, peripheral schools in my country and ask them how they feel, how they perceive the isolation, the educational isolation. I don't figure out how to do it, but I think it's to put the subjective versus the objective definition. It seems to me very interesting.
It's really important. You know, it has to come from the ground up. So our concept has come from school leaders. And Philly, the reason we asked Philly to be the discussant is that she's doing a PhD to create a composite indicator model of educational isolation. So what she's working really hard on at the moment is quantifying, really, or trying to create a very accurate definition that could be applied objectively to all schools, initially in England, and so we can say that school's education isolated, that's not. You can imagine how difficult that is in terms of geographical remoteness. She's using a system called TRACK. Cultural isolation is a humdinger, but she's getting there and will be completing at the end of this academic year. It is this academic year, isn't it? So, but it's quite exciting because we can use our national data and map it against the composite indicator model and then identify schools as educationally isolated. However, the whole of the concept has come from school leaders. So you need to go in and ask them, you know, how do you feel? What is your experience? And is there cultural isolation by this definition? If not, what is it for you? We are very open to challenge and, you know, be disruptive. If this isn't working, this was our first opportunity really to conceptualize it. And we are open to being completely wrong or adapting or amending or whatever. Now, we're quite close to time. In fact, we've just gone over a minute, but I know Eva wanted to say something. We're due to finish at 10:02, and it's 9 minutes.
Well, I was just thinking about that the outcome seems to be always the same, right? So the pupils at the disadvantaged schools we can say that they all have less chances to to succeed later in life and so on, or the chances are smaller than the chances of students that are at schools that aren't as disadvantaged. But I think looking from this outcome perspective, there is this problem that, or it could be a problem that then what actually happens at the individual school, that people don't look at it anymore, and that we then get these programs that are, because it's all about funding in the end, right? So what do? What are the measures that you bring into the school to help with it, to help them overcome the disadvantages, that there's this one big program that's like one fits all, where it doesn't fit all, because if you look at the individual school, it's so different. And that's also why I think that this idea that they came up with this, with the adaptiveness, was so nice, that it's actually looks at the level of what the actual teachers at the school need, or maybe the school leaders need, and then would adapt whatever the the grand scheme is to that specific school situation, and not just have like one big program that's supposed to fit everything and then it doesn't.
I think what we did was a step before that. So what we identified, which we didn't have time to go into, we had to kind of choose one of the areas that resources were limited in, was opportunities to apply for external funding. We found again and again that these educationally isolated schools didn't have the resources, they didn't have the staff or the time or the capacity to apply for the externally funded interventions that could have helped them provide the school improvement that they needed. So they couldn't even get to the point in accessing that. And we've had a lot over the last 10 years of externally funded projects, but yeah, they just don't have the capacity to do it. So the same schools who have the additional resource were able to keep applying and keep getting better. And even our Ofsted inspection regime referred to them as hard to reach schools. But there's a reason for that.
I think therefore Schumers took a different way. So they decided it's not the schools who are going to apply for the program, but it's educational administration within the federal states selecting the schools for the program. Of course, you could say this also, then also not all schools have the same chances, but it could help that not always the same schools are in these programs. Because that's what I observed as someone who's for 20 years now in Germany in dealing with these type of programs. And if you look at 3 or 4 nationwide programs, there's a specific set of schools that are occurring again and again. They know how to apply. And therefore, we need also an alternative approach.
This feels like a really good point to end on, because actually where we started with all this research was to try and target the resources to the schools that needed it most. And so one of the calls that we put out to policymakers in England and colleagues internationally is target the resources where they're needed most. So the schools don't have to apply, but the policymakers know where those resources are needed and therefore support equity rather than disadvantage. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely travel home, safe travels.